Queens, New York, summer of 1977. The city is tense. The infamous son of Sam killer stalks the streets. Fear is on every corner. And yet, amid the chaos, another tragedy unfolds quietly. One that would go almost unnoticed for nearly half a century. 19-year-old Judith Brown was days away from walking down the aisle. She had a bright future, a fiancé she adored, and a family counting down to her wedding day. But one evening, without a trace, Judith vanished, her apartment untouched, her wedding dress still hanging in the closet, and her fiancé offering only a vague explanation. She left. For decades, no one asked enough questions. No new leads, no answers. Until now. A single podcast episode has cracked open the silence, pointing the finger at a man with a past as dark as the city that summer. Was Judith a runaway bride, or the victim of something far more sinister? Judith Ann Brown was born in 1958, a shy but ambitious young woman raised in a working-class Queens neighborhood. Friends remember her as kind-hearted, deeply loyal, and full of quiet determination. She worked part-time at a local diner while finishing her schooling and dreamed of starting a family of her own. To those who knew her, Judith was gentle, trusting, and sometimes too forgiving. She met Richard Riesenberg when she was just 17. He was older, charismatic, but troubled. Family members later revealed that Richard had a violent temper and was rumored to be associated with dangerous men. Some even linked him to circles under investigation during the Son of Sam shootings. Judith's parents worried about the relationship, but Judith believed in him, believing love could change anyone. By 1977, Judith had moved into Richard's small Queens apartment, cutting some ties with friends who warned her to be careful. She was planning her wedding, talking excitedly about the dress she had saved for, and writing letters to her mother about starting a new chapter. There was no sign she wanted to run, no sign of fear, only a young woman in love, days away from what was supposed to be the happiest moment of her life. But behind closed doors, cracks were beginning to show. Arguments were overheard by neighbors. Judith confided in a friend about Richard's jealousy and unpredictable anger. Yet, she stayed, insisting that once they married, things would get better. Nobody could have imagined that within days, Judith would vanish without leaving so much as a goodbye. The disappearance of Judith Brown never made front-page news. In the summer of 1977, New York was already drowning in fear. The Son of Sam killer dominated headlines. The city was in chaos, and police departments were stretched thin. A missing 19-year-old bride-to-be. Detectives labeled her a likely runaway, a young woman who got cold feet before her wedding. Her family knew that wasn't true. Judith had no money with her, no extra clothes, not even her wedding invitations she had carefully written out by hand. Everything remained exactly as she'd left it, her purse on the counter, her bridal gown untouched. Yet the case was quietly filed away, collecting dust in a drawer marked voluntary disappearance. For decades, Judith's name faded from memory. Her mother visited police stations every year, begging someone to reopen the file. Detectives changed, case notes were lost, leads disappeared. As time passed, Richard Riesenberg moved on. He reportedly left Queens, changed his name, and even remarried in another state. There were whispers that he'd been violent with Judith, that he'd been involved in other crimes. But without a body, without evidence, no one could make anything stick. Judith's family was left to grieve in silence, haunted by unanswered questions. Did she suffer? Did someone help cover it up? Or was she still out there, somewhere, alive but unable to come home? For nearly 50 years, the truth lay buried under time, indifference, and secrets too dangerous to reveal. In 2024, Judith's story resurfaced not from police files, but from the power of modern media. A popular investigative show, The Vanished Podcast, dedicated an entire episode to her disappearance. What started as one family's desperate plea for answers exploded into a national discussion about lost cold cases and ignored victims of the 1970s. The podcast unearthed disturbing new details. Former neighbors came forward with claims they'd been afraid to share before. One woman remembered hearing screaming from Judith's apartment days before she vanished. Another recalled seeing Richard late that night, alone, with scratches on his face and mud on his clothes. A retired NYPD officer admitted that in 1977, investigators were told to not push too hard, Because Richard allegedly had ties to men under surveillance during the Son of Sam investigation, a chilling suggestion that Judith's case might have been buried on purpose. Even more shocking were the allegations that Richard had reinvented himself multiple times. Listeners sent in tips claiming Richard lived under at least 2 different names in Florida and Pennsylvania. One caller claimed he confessed, drunkenly, to getting rid of a girl in New York years ago. None of this has been officially confirmed, but the podcast reignited public outrage, with thousands demanding police reopen the case. For the first time in decades, people are asking, was Judith Brown's disappearance a tragic runaway story? Or the perfect murder, hidden in plain sight? Could modern forensic tools, DNA testing, ground-penetrating radar, and digital case analysis finally reveal what really happened on that hot July night in 1977? The podcast gave Judith her voice back, but it also raised terrifying questions about how many other stories just like hers have been lost to time, and whether a killer has been living free for nearly 50 years. Let's step back and piece together what we know. Nearly 50 years later, the timeline of Judith Brown's disappearance still feels like fragments of a puzzle scattered in the dark. July 16, 1977, 3 p.m. Judith is last seen leaving her mother's home in Queens, excitedly talking about final wedding preparations. She tells her younger sister she'd be back the next day. She never returns. July 16, 1977, 8 p.m. Neighbors report hearing shouting coming from Judith and Richard's apartment. One voice believed to be Judith screams, "Stop! You're hurting me." The noise stops abruptly. No one calls police. July 17, 1977, morning. Richard tells friends Judith left in the night, saying she had second thoughts about the wedding. He claims she took off without her belongings. This statement would later contradict every fact investigators uncovered. July 18 to 20, 1977. Judith's parents file a missing persons report. Detectives conduct a brief interview with Richard but accept his version of events. They do not search the apartment. They do not issue alerts. The city is consumed by Son of Sam terror, and Judith's case is marked low priority. Late 1977. Witnesses later admit they saw Richard loading large garbage bags into the trunk of his car that week. No forensic testing is ever done. Richard moves out of the apartment 2 months later. 1980s, 1990s. The case goes cold. Judith's family continues to ask questions, writing to police chiefs, newspapers, and TV stations, but they receive little response. Richard reportedly remarries in another state. No charges are ever filed. 2024. The Vanished podcast revisits the story, sparking national outrage and pushing for the case to be officially reopened with modern investigative tools. Asterisk. Nearly every piece of this timeline points in one direction. But without hard evidence, no one has ever been held accountable for Judith's disappearance, which leads us to the disturbing theories investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths are now piecing together. Many believe Richard Riesenberg killed Judith during a violent argument, possibly over doubts about the wedding or jealousy. Witnesses recall hearing Judith scream. Neighbors saw Richard with scratches on his face, and his story about her running away never matched the facts. With no missing belongings, no money taken, and her wedding just days away, it's difficult to imagine Judith leaving voluntarily. Some retired detectives now admit that if this happened today, Richard would likely have been the prime suspect, subjected to immediate searches, forensic sweeps, and interrogation. In 1977, it was simply overlooked. The podcast raised another chilling possibility. Richard may have had ties to men already under police surveillance during the Son of Sam investigation. Former NYPD officers hinted that certain suspects had connections to organized crime or underground networks that trafficked women. Could Judith's case have been intentionally deprioritized because Richard had friends in dangerous places? If so, did these connections help bury the truth, or worse, was Judith's disappearance part of a larger, unreported crime ring operating in Queens at the time? Finally, some theorize Judith was buried close to the apartment or another location Richard frequented. Modern forensic experts believe ground-penetrating radar and DNA testing could still uncover evidence, even decades later. Multiple listeners of the podcast have called in with tips about rumored shallow graves near abandoned lots Richard once visited, raising the horrifying possibility that Judith never left Queens at all, and her remains have been waiting to be found for nearly 50 years. Whether this was a crime of passion, a coordinated cover-up, or a long-hidden murder, one thing is clear: Judith Brown didn't run away. Something happened in that apartment on July 16, 1977, and someone has been walking free for decades, carrying a secret only they can tell. For nearly 5 decades, Judith's story was nothing more than a forgotten file buried in a dusty drawer. But one podcast episode changed everything. Within weeks of its release, over 3 million listeners were captivated by Judith's tragedy. Social media campaigns reignited public interest, generating thousands of tips, messages, and even anonymous calls to the NYPD cold case unit. The attention forced law enforcement to revisit Judith's file. Old evidence once thought useless is now undergoing modern forensic analysis. Advances in DNA testing, soil examination, and digital crime scene reconstruction may finally answer what police failed to uncover in 1977. Search dogs are being redeployed to old dump sites rumored to be linked to Richard. Detectives are tracking his movements under aliases in Florida and Pennsylvania. For the first time, the possibility of justice for Judith Brown feels real. But until her remains are found, or someone confesses, Judith's family and the world must keep asking questions, refusing to let her memory fade again. Judith Brown's disappearance is not just a cold case. It's a story of neglect, secrets, and decades of silence. A story that could still end with the truth coming to light, but only if people keep pushing for answers. What do you think happened that summer night in 1977? Was Judith a victim of rage, a wider cover-up, or something darker that's yet to be revealed? Share your theories in the comments below. We read every single one. If you believe Judith deserves justice, don't let her story disappear again. Hit like, tap subscribe, and turn on the bell icon, because every week, we uncover another unsolved case that time tried to forget. And maybe, just maybe, one of you out there holds the missing piece.